In Project Human Resource Management, let's talk about leadership for a few minutes. Behavioral scientists have been studying leadership for about 100 years. And let's first distinguish management from leadership. People distinguish the two by saying the role of management is to promote stability or enable the organization to run smoothly. But the role of leadership is to promote adaptive or useful changes. Now, we want both in a project manager. Of course, we want the project manager to run the project in a smooth manner, but we also need leadership in the project manager, which let's further elaborate it as the process of influencing others to understand and agree what needs to be done and how to do it, and the process of facilitating individual and collective efforts to accomplish our objectives. So, for the longest time, behavioral scientists were looking at the trait theory of leadership. They were trying to figure out which personality traits effective leaders had. And the research wasn't really very effective until recently we have found out that some traits do tend to predict leadership outcomes. Ambition, motivation, honesty, self-confidence, and a high need for achievement are correlated with project management, but these are not sufficient or conclusive in themselves. So behavioral scientists went on to the behavioristic theory, and this suggested that it's how we behave that's the most important thing rather than internal traits. Now, a corollary from leadership being how we behave is that our behavior can be learned. And in fact, I'm quoting Peter Drucker here, who said that leadership can be learned and must be learned. In other words, we can learn to be better at the leadership behaviors. We're going to focus a little bit on situational leadership. This is a theory that says that leader behavior can be described on two axes, on a production orientation and an employee orientation. So let's look at this. This is from Hersey and Blanchard, who published this in 1988 and in later publications by them. So if I am the leader, my behavior could be described on these two axes. My behavior, that is, with a particular team member or in a particular situation. The horizontal axis is task behavior or guidance or directive behavior, some people say. If I'm telling people what to do and how to do it, I'm behaving on the right portion of the grid. If I'm not telling people actually how to do it, then I'm acting on the left side of the grid. And the vertical axis is relationship behavior or supportive behavior. How much am I focusing on the employee and developing that employee? So I could, let's say that I or you are managing a tree planting operation in Northern Ontario. In the summer, you get a batch of high school students and undergraduate students arriving. You're probably going to start off in the telling position. You're providing specific instructions and you're closely supervising performance. You're telling them specifically how to plant trees such that you don't hurt your back, and but you still make a reasonable number in order to make your quota. Hersey and Blanchard were suggesting that your behavior on this grid would depend on the maturity of your employees. Employees down here, they suggest, are unable or unwilling or unsecure. Employees up here are unable, but they're willing or confident. Employees over here are able, but unwilling or unsecure, and down here are able and willing or confident. So the lower right, you're telling the employee what to do. As the employee becomes more experienced, you may switch into a selling mode, is what Hersey and Blanchard calls it. You're still telling them how to do the job, but you're explaining and clarifying, helping them understand. As the employee becomes more mature, you could go into participating mode. I prefer to call it coaching mode. Here, You're leaving the actual behavior up to the employee, but you're available for coaching. You're available to talk with them through any difficult spots. And as the employee becomes more mature, you're switching down here to delegating. Remember, I said that the employee is able and willing and confident about doing the job. A senior professional doesn't need you to be coaching or telling them what to do. They just want you to delegate the work and go away and let them do it. Now, Hersey and Blanchard were focusing on the maturity of the employee, but it could be there could be other things that determine where on this grid we might behave. So here's a model that was published in the project management literature, the Bonomo-Slevin model, published by Slevin and Pinto. This model asks a slightly different question. It says there is a decision to be made, and the horizontal axis, and you are the leader. The horizontal axis says who actually takes the authority to get the decision made. Do you take the authority? If you make the decision, then you're acting on the right-hand side of this grid. If you do not make the decision, and if you leave it up to others, you're acting on the left side of the grid. Now, the other axis asks the question, how much information do you get from your team? Do you have a lot of conversation with the team, in which case you're acting high on the grid, or do you have little or no information input from the team, you're acting low on the grid? Now, arguably, anyone's place on that grid could be appropriate depending upon the circumstances. So let's look at the four corners. If you're acting as an autocrat, you're soliciting very little information, and you are making the decision. There's going to be times when that's appropriate. Up here in the top right, you're a consultative autocrat. The authors do not mean autocrat as a negative word. They mean it as a descriptor. In consultative autocrat, you are extensively discussing with team members, and you're using that information to help you make a decision. I think this is appropriate a lot of the time. There's times when it's going to be appropriate to be a consensus manager in the top left. You're throwing open the problem to the group for discussion, and you are facilitating the group into making a group decision. Now, by the way, consensus does not mean that everybody fully agrees that this is the best possible answer, but consensus is that everybody supports the decision because they were part of the process and they support the decision. Now, there's going to be times when you do not discuss with the group and you do not make a decision. This does not sound very good, and in fact, it would not be appropriate a lot of the time. But there may be times when it is appropriate. Maybe postponement is okay. Not doing anything is all right. Maybe the question is in an inbox of one of your team members. Well, you don't have to get involved. You're not soliciting any information. You're not making a decision. You're leaving it up to the others. And the response could depend on, as we say here, what's the attributes of the problem? Is this a problem that is urgent, in which case autocratic decision is going to be appropriate? Is it important? Then probably being fairly northerly on that grid would be appropriate, getting input from others. Is it routine? Then possibly the southwest or southeast corners would be okay. What's the organizational environment? Is this a kind of environment that's used to a command and control structure? In that case, the consensus management probably won't work. Or is this a culture in which consensus management is the norm and trying to be autocratic is not going to work? And what's the nature of the team members? What's their maturity in terms of their ability and willingness to do the job, as we discussed earlier, and your own personality? Do you tend to be an autocratic leader? You might choose to be in situations, projects where that is more appropriate rather than be in an organization which is very creative and consensus oriented. In fact, this this model, I like to put it with this compass rose superimposed over it, because in various situations it may be appropriate to act in a northerly fashion, generally at the top of the grid, or in a northeasterly fashion, or a southwesterly fashion, or generally south, or generally west, is a good way to talk about what might be appropriate on the grid. Now, people talk about a spectrum of leadership. You know, there is a leader's style can go all the way from utter authoritarian through to laissez-faire, doesn't care at all, from total control to zero control. Now, leadership theorists suggest that most of this grid, just cutting off the extreme ends left and right, most of this continuum will be effective at getting people to do things. But it is seen to be the fact that the methods that tend to be more facilitative oriented tend to be more effective than on the more directive end of the scale. And that brings us to an end of this very brief discussion of leadership in project management.